2,558 years ago, a little fleet of galleys toiled painfully against the current up the long strait of the Hellespont, rowed across the broad Propontis, and came to anchor in the smooth waters of the first inlet, which cuts into the European shore of the Bosphorus. There a long crescent-shaped creek, which after ages were to know as the Golden Horn, strikes inland for 7 miles, forming a quiet backwater from the rapid stream which runs outside. On the headland, enclosed between this inlet and the open sea, few hundred colonists disembarked and hastily secured themselves from the wild tribes of the inland by running some rough sort of a stockade across the ground from beach to beach. Thus was founded the city of Byzantium. The settlers were Greeks of the Dorian race, natives of the thriving seaport state of Megara, one of the most enterprising Surutu of all the cities of Hellas, in the time of colonial and commercial expansion, which was then at its height. Wherever a Greek prow had cut its way into unknown waters, there Megarian seamen were soon found following in its wake. One band of these venturesome traders pushed far to the west to plant colonies in Sicily, but the larger share of the attention of Megara was turned towards the sun rising, towards the mist-enshrouded entrance of the Black Sea and the fabulous lands that lay beyond. There, as legends told, was to be found the realm of the Golden Fleece, the El Dorado of the ancient world, where kings of untold wealth reigned over the tribes of Colchis. There dwelt, by the banks of the river Thermodon, the Amazons, the warlike women who had once vexed far-off Greece by their inroads. There, too, was to be found, if one could but struggle far enough up its northern shore, the land of the Hyperboreans, the blessed folk who dwell behind the north wind and know nothing of storm and winter. To seek these fabled wonders, the Greeks sailed ever north and east, till they'd come to the extreme limits of the sea. The riches of the Golden Fleece they did not find, nor the country of the Hyperboreans, nor the tribes of the Amazons. But they did discover many lands well worth the knowing, and grew rich on the profits which they drew from the metals of Colchis and the forests of Paphlagonia, from the rich cornlands by the banks of the Dnieper and Bug, and the fisheries of the Bosphorus and the Maeotic Lake. Presently the whole coastland of the sea, which the Greeks on their first coming called Axenos, the inhospitable, became fringed with trading settlements, and its name was changed to Euxenos, the hospitable, in recognition of its friendly ports. It was in a similar spirit that, 2,000 years later, the seamen hold the next great impulse of exploration that rose in Europe, turned the name of the Cape of Storms into that of the Cape of Good Hope. The Megarians, almost more than any other Greeks, devoted their attention to the Euxine, and the foundation of Byzantium was but one of their many achievements. Already 17 years before Byzantium came into being, another band of Megarian colonists had established themselves at Chalcedon, on the opposite Asiatic shore of the Bosphorus. The settlers who were destined to found the greater city applied to the Oracle of Delphi to give them advice as to the site of their new home. And Apollo, we are told, bade them build their town over against the city of the blind. They therefore pitched upon the headland by the Golden Horn, reasoning that the Chalcedonians were truly blind to have neglected the more eligible site on the Thracian shore, in order to found a colony on the far less inviting Bithynian side of the strait. From the first, its situation marked out Byzantium as destined for a great future. Alike from the military and from the commercial point of view, no city could have been better placed. Looking out from the easternmost headland of Thrace, with all Europe behind it and all Asia before, it was equally well suited to be the frontier fortress to defend the border of Thyone, Thebes's year 04, of operations for an invasion from the other. As fortresses went in those early days, it was almost impregnable. Two sides protected by the water, the third by a strong wall not commanded by any neighboring heights. In all its early history, Byzantium never fell by storm. Famine or treachery accounted for the few occasions on which it fell into the hands of an enemy. In its commercial aspect, the place was even more favorably situated. It completely commanded the whole Black Sea trade. Every vessel that went forth from Greece or Ionia to traffic with Scythia or Colchis, the lands by the Danube mouth or the shores of the Maeotic Lake, had to pass close under its walls, so that the prosperity of 100 Hellenic towns on the Euxine was always at the mercy of the masters of Byzantium. The Greek loved short stages and frequent stoppages, and as a halfway house alone, Byzantium would have been prosperous. But it had also a flourishing local trade of its own with the tribes of the neighboring Thracian inland, and drew much profit from its fisheries. So much so that the city badge, its coat of arms as we should call, comprised a tunny fish as well as the famous ox, whose form alluded to the legend of the naming of the Bosphorus d'Autinois as an independent state. Byzantium had a long and eventful history. For 30 years it was in the hands of the kings of Persia, but with that short exception, it maintained its freedom during the first 300 years that followed its foundation. Many stirring scenes took place beneath its walls. It was close to them that the great Darius threw across the Bosphorus his bridge of boats, which served as a model for the more famous structure on which his son Xerxes crossed the Hellespont. 15 years later, when Byzantium, in common with all its neighbors, made an ineffectual attempt to throw off the Persian yoke in the rising called the Ionic Revolt, it was held for a time by the arch-rebel Histiaeus, who, as much to enrich himself as to pay his seamen, invented straight dues. He forced every ship passing up or down the Bosphorus to pay a heavy toll, and won no small unpopularity thereby for the cause of freedom which he professed to champion. Ere long, Byzantium fell back again into the hands of Persia, but she was finally freed from the Oriental yoke 17 years later, when the victorious Greeks, fresh from the triumph of Salamis and Mycale, sailed up to her walls and after a long leaguer starved out the obstinate garrison, BC 479. The fleet wintered there, and it was at Byzantium that the first foundations of the naval empire of Athens were laid, when all the Greek states of Asia placed their ships at the disposal of the Athenian admirals Cimon and Aristides. During the 5th century, Byzantium twice declared war on Athens, now the mistress of the seas, and on each occasion fell into the hands of the enemy. Once by voluntary surrender in 439 BC, once by treachery from within in 408 BC. But the Athenians, except in 1 or 2 disgraceful cases, did not deal hardly with their conquered enemies, and the Byzantines escaped anything harder than the payment of a heavy war indemnity. In a few years, their commercial gains repaired all the losses of war, and the state was itself again. We know comparatively little about the internal history of these early centuries of the life of Byzantium. Some odd fragments of information survive here and there. We know, for example, that they used iron instead of copper for small money, a peculiarity shared by no other ancient state save Sparta. Their alphabet rejoiced in an abnormally shaped, which puzzled all other Greeks, for it resembled a with an extra limb. The chief gods of the city were those that we might have expected: Poseidon, the ruler of the sea, whose blessing gave Byzantium its chief wealth, and Demeter, the goddess who presided over the Thracian and Scythian cornlands, which form at its second source of prosperity. The Byzantines were, if ancient chroniclers tell us the truth, a luxurious as well as a busy race. They spent too much time in their numerous inns, where the excellent wines of Maronea and other neighboring places offered great temptations. They were gluttons too, as well as tipplers. On one occasion, we are assured, the whole civic militia struck work in the height of a siege, till their commander consented to allow restaurants to be erected at convenient distances round the ramparts. One comic writer informs us that the Byzantines were eating young tunny fish, their favorite dish, so constantly that their whole bodies had become well-nigh gelatinous, and it was thought they might melt if exposed to too great heat. Probably these tales are the scandals of neighbors who envied Byzantine prosperity, for it is at any rate certain that the city showed all through its history great energy and love of independence, and never shrank from war as we should have expected a nation of epicures to do. It was not till the rise of Philip of Macedon and his greater son Alexander that Byzantium fell for the 5th time into the hands of an enemy. The elder king was repulsed from the city's walls after a long siege, culminating in an attempt at an escalade by night, which was frustrated owing to the sudden appearance of a light in heaven, which revealed the advancing enemy and was taken by the Byzantines as a token of special divine aid. BC 339. In commemoration of it, they assumed as one of their civic badges the blazing crescent and star, which has descended to our own days and is still used as an emblem by the present owners of the city, the Ottoman sultans. But after repulsing Philip, the Byzantines they recovered a precarious freedom and were again an independent community for 100 years, till the power of Rome invaded the regions of Thrace and the Hellespont. Byzantium was one of the cities which took the wise course of making an early alliance with the Romans, and obtained good and easy terms in consequence. During the wars of Rome with Macedon and Antiochus the Great, it proved such a faithful assistant that the Senate gave it the status of a civitas libera et foederata, a free and confederate city, and it was not taken under direct Roman government, but allowed complete liberty in everything save the control of its foreign relations and the payment of a tribute to Rome. It was not till the Roman Republic had long passed away that the Emperor Vespasian stripped it of these privileges and threw it into the province of Thrace to exist for the future as an ordinary provincial town, AD 73. Though deprived of a liberty which had for long years been almost nominal, Byzantium could not be deprived of its unrivaled position for commerce. It continued to flourish under the Pax Romana, the long-continued peace which all the inner countries of the empire enjoyed during the first 2 centuries of the imperial regime, and is mentioned again and again as one EO9 of the most important cities of the middle regions of the Roman world. But an evil time for Byzantium, as for all the other parts of the civilized world, began when the golden age of the Antonines ceased, and the epoch of the military emperors followed. In 192 D, Commodus, the unworthy son of the great and good Marcus Aurelius, was murdered, and ere long 3 military usurpers were wrangling for his blood-stained diadem. Most unhappily for itself, Byzantium lay on the line of division between the eastern provinces, where Pescennius Niger had been proclaimed, and the Illyrian provinces, where Severus had assumed the imperial style. The city was seized by the army of Syria and strengthened in haste. Presently Severus appeared from the west, after he had made himself master of Rome and Italy, and fell upon the forces of his rival Pescennius. Victory followed the arms of the Illyrian legions. The east was subdued, and the Syrian emperor put to death. But when all his other adherents had yielded, the garrison of Byzantium refused to submit. For more than 2 years they maintained the impregnable city against the lieutenants of Severus, and it was not till AD 196 that they were forced to yield. The emperor appeared in person to punish the long protracted resistance of the town. Not only the garrison, but the civil magistrates of Byzantium were slain before his eyes. The massive walls, so firmly built with great square stones clamped together with bolts of iron, that the whole seemed but one block, were laboriously cast down. The property of the citizens was confiscated, and the town itself deprived of all municipal privileges, and handed over to be governed like a dependent village by its neighbors of Perinthus. Caracalla, the son of Severus, gave back to the Byzantines the right to govern themselves, but the town had received a hard blow and would have required a long spell of peace to recover its prosperity. Peace, however, it was not destined to see. All through the middle years of the 3rd century, it was vexed by the incursions of the Goths, who harried mercilessly the countries on the Black Sea, whose commerce sustained its trade. Under Gallienus in AD 263, it was again seized by an usurping emperor and shared the fate of his adherents. The soldiers of Gallienus sacked Byzantium from cellar to garret, and made such a slaughter of its inhabitants that it is said that the old Megarian race who had so long possessed it were absolutely exterminated. But the irresistible attraction of the site was too great to allow its ruins to remain desolate. Within 10 years after its sack by the army of Gallienus, we find Byzantium again a populous town, and its inhabitants are specially praised by the historian Trebellius Pollio for the courage with which they repelled a Gothic raid in the reign of Claudius II. Wave, the strong Illyrian emperors, who staved off from the Roman Empire the ruin which appeared about to overwhelm it in the 3rd quarter of the 3rd century, gave Byzantium time and peace to recover its ancient prosperity. It profited especially from the constant neighborhood of the imperial court, after Diocletian fixed his residence at Nicomedia, only 60 miles away, on the Bithynian side of the Propontis. But the military importance of Byzantium was always interfering with its commercial greatness. After the abdication of Diocletian the Empire was for 20 years, vexed by constant partitions of territory between the colleagues whom he left behind him. Byzantium after a while found itself the border fortress of Licinius, the emperor who ruled in the Balkan Peninsula, while Maximinus Daza was governing the Asiatic provinces. While Licinius was absent in Italy, Maximinus treacherously attacked his rival's dominions without declaration of war, and took Byzantium by surprise. But the Illyrian emperor returned in haste, defeated his grasping neighbor not far from the walls of the city, and recovered his great frontier fortress after it had been only a few months out of his hands, AD 314. The town must have suffered severely by changing masters twice in the same year. It does not, however, seem to have been sacked or burnt, as was so often the case with a captured city in those dismal days. But Licinius, when he had recovered the place, set to work to render it impregnable. Though it was not his capital, he made it the chief fortress of his realm, which, since the defeat of Maximinus, embraced the whole eastern half of the Roman world. It was accordingly at Byzantium that Licinius made his last desperate stand, when in AD 323 he found himself engaged in an unsuccessful war with his brother-in-law Constantine, the Emperor of the West. For many months the war stood still beneath the walls of the city, but Constantine persevered and so 12th the siege, raising great mounds which overlooked the walls, and sweeping away the defenders by a constant stream of missiles, launched from dozens of military engines which he had erected on these artificial heights. At last the city surrendered, and the cause of Licinius was lost. Constantine, the last of his rivals subdued, became the sole emperor of the Roman world, and stood a victor on the ramparts which were ever afterwards to bear his name, when the fall of Byzantium had wrecked the fortunes of Licinius. The Roman world was again united beneath the scepter of a single master. For 37 years, ever since Diocletian parceled out the provinces with his colleagues, unity had been unknown, and emperors, whose number had sometimes risen to 6 and sometimes sunk to 2, had administered their realms on different principles and with varying success. Constantine, whose victory over his rivals had been secured by his talents as an administrator and a diplomatist, no less than by his military skill, was one of those men whose hard practical ability has stamped upon the history of the world a much deeper impress than has been left by many conquerors and legislators of infinitely greater genius. He was a man of that self-contained, self-reliant, unsympathetic type of mind, which we recognize in his great predecessor Augustus, or in Frederick the Great of Prussia, though the strain of old Roman blood in his veins must have been but small. Constantine was in many ways a typical Roman. The hard, cold, steady, unwearying energy, which in earlier centuries had won the empire of the world, was once more incarnate in him. But if Roman in character, he was anything but Roman in his sympathies. Born by the Danube, reared in the Mio-15 courts and camps of Asia and Gaul, he was absolutely free from any of that superstitious reverence for the ancient glories of the city on the Tiber, which had inspired so many of his predecessors. Italy was to him but a secondary province amongst his wide realms. When he distributed his dominions among his heirs, it was Gaul that he gave as the noblest share to his eldest and best-loved son. Italy was to him a younger child's portion. There had been emperors before him who had neglected Rome. The barbarian Maximinus I had dwelt by the Rhine and the Danube. The politic Diocletian had chosen Nicomedia as his favorite residence, but no one had yet dreamed of raising up a rival to the mistress of the world, and of turning Rome into a provincial town. If preceding emperors had dwelt far afield, it was to meet the exigencies of war on the frontiers, or the government of distant provinces. It was reserved for Constantine to erect over against Rome a rival metropolis for the civilized world, an imperial city which was to be neither a mere camp nor a mere court, but the administrative and commercial center of the Roman world. 16. For more than 100 years, Rome had been a most inconvenient residence for the emperors. The main problem which had been before them was the repelling of incessant barbarian inroads on the Balkan Peninsula. The troubles on the Rhine and the Euphrates, though real enough, had been but minor evils. Rome, placed halfway down the long projection of Italy, handicapped beats bad harbors and separate the frontiers of the empire by the passes of the Alps, was too far away from the points where the emperor was most wanted, the banks of the Danube and the walls of Sirmium and Singidunum. For the ever-recurring wars with Persia, it was even more inconvenient. But these were less pressing dangers. No Persian army had yet penetrated beyond Antioch, only 200 miles from the frontier, while in the Balkan Peninsula, the Goths had broken so far into the heart of the empire as to sack Athens and Thessalonica. Footstool while the populace chanted, in allusion to the names of the vanquished princes, the verse, "Thou shalt trample on the lion and the asp." Down the center of the hippodrome ran the spina, or division wall, which every circus showed. It was ornamented with three most curious monuments, whose strange juxtaposition seemed almost to typify the heterogeneous materials from which the new city was built up. The first and oldest was an obelisk brought from Egypt, and covered with the usual hieroglyphic inscriptions. The second was the most notable, though one of the least beautiful, of the antiquities of Constantinople. It was the three-headed brazen serpent, which Pausanias and the victorious Iannoni V Greeks had dedicated at Delphi in 479 BC, after they had destroyed the Persian army at Plataea. The golden tripod, which was supported by the heads of the serpents, had long been wanting. The sacrilegious Phocians had stolen it 6 centuries before, but the dedicatory inscriptions engraved on the coils of the pedestal survived then, and survive now, to delight the archaeologist. The third monument on the spina was a square bronze column of more modern work, contrasting strangely with the venerable antiquity of its neighbors. By some freak of chance, all three monuments have remained till our own day. The vast walls of the hippodrome have crumbled away, but its central decorations still stand erect in the midst of an open space, which the Turks call the At Meydan, or place of horses, in dim memory of its ancient use. Along the outer eastern wall of the hippodrome on the western edge of the Augusteum stood a range of small chapels and statues, the most important landmark among them being the Million, or central milestone of the empire, which we have already described. The statues, few at first, were increased by later emperors, till they extended along the whole length of the forum. Constantine's own contribution to the collection was a tall porphyry column, surmounted by a bronze image which had once been the tutelary Apollo of the city of Hierapolis, but was turned into a representation of the emperor by the easy method of knocking off its head and substituting the imperial features. It was exactly the reverse of a change which can be seen at Rome, where the popes have removed the head of the Emperor Aurelius and turned him into St. Peter. On the column in the Corso, the edifices which we have described formed the heart of Constantinople. Between the palace, the hippodrome, and the cathedral, most of the important events in the history of the city took place. But to north and west, the city extended for miles, and everywhere there were buildings of note, though no other cluster could vie with that round the Augusteum. The Church of the Holy Apostles, which Constantine destined as the burying place of his family, was the second among the ecclesiastical edifices of the town. Of the outlying civil buildings, the public granaries along the quays, the Golden Gate, by which the great road from the west entered the walls, and the palace of the Praetorian Prefect, who acted as governor of the city, must all have been well worthy of notice. A statue of Constantine on horseback, which stood by the last-named edifice, was one of the chief shows of Constantinople down to the end of the Middle Ages, and some curious legends gathered around it. It was in AD 328 or 329, the exact date is not easily to be fixed, that Constantine had definitely chosen Byzantium for his capital and drawn out the plan for its development. As early as May 11, 330, the buildings were so far advanced that he was able to hold the festival which celebrated its consecration. Christian bishops blessed the partially completed palace and held the first service in St. Sophia. For Constantine, though still unbaptized himself, had determined that the new city should be Christian from the first. Of paganism there was no trace in it, save a few of the old temples of the Byzantines, spared when the older streets were leveled to clear the ground for the palace and adjoining buildings. The statues of the gods which adorned the baths and Senate House stood there as works of art, not as objects of worship. To fill the vast limits of his city, Constantine invited many senators of old Rome and many rich provincial proprietors of Greece and Asia to take up their abode in it, granting them places in his new senate and sites for the dwellings they would require. The countless officers and functionaries of the imperial court, with their subordinates and slaves, must have composed a very considerable element in the new population. The artisans and handicraftsmen were enticed in thousands by the offer of special privileges. Merchants and seamen had always abounded at Byzantium, and now flocked in numbers, which made the old commercial prosperity of the city seem insignificant. Most effective, though most demoralizing of the gifts which Constantine bestowed on the new capital to attract immigrants, was the old Roman privilege of free distribution of corn to the populace. The wheat tribute of Egypt, which had previously formed part of the public provision of Rome, was transferred to the use of Constantinople, only the African corn from Carthage or 30 being for the future assigned for the subsistence of the older city. On the completion of the dedication festival in 330 AD, an imperial edict gave the city the title of New Rome, and the record was placed on a marble tablet near the equestrian statue of the emperor, opposite the Strategion. But New Rome was a phrase destined to subsist in poetry and rhetoric alone. The world from the first very rightly gave the city the founder's name only, and persisted in calling it Constantinople. Constantine lived 7 years after he had completed the dedication of his new city, and died in peace and prosperity on the 22nd of May, AD 337, received on his deathbed into that Christian church on whose verge he had lingered during the last half of his life. By his will he left his realm to be divided among his sons and nephews, but a rapid succession of murders and civil wars thinned out the imperial house, and ended in the concentration of the whole empire from the Forth to the Tigris under the scepter of Constantius II, the second son of the great emperor. The Roman world was not yet quite ripe for a permanent division. It was still possible to manage it from a single center, for by some strange chance the barbarian invasions which had troubled the 3rd century had ceased for a time, and the Romans were untroubled, save by some minor bickerings on the Rhine and the Euphrates. Constantius II, an administrator of some ability, but gloomy, suspicious, and unsympathetic, was able to devote his leisure to ecclesiastical controversies, and to dishonor himself by starting the first persecution of Christian by a third Christian that the world had seen. The crisis in the history of the empire was not destined to fall in his day, nor in the short reign of his cousin and successor, Julian, the amiable and cultured but entirely wrong-headed pagan zealot, who strove to put back the clock of time and restore the worship of the ancient gods of Greece. Both Constantius and Julian, if asked whence danger to the empire might be expected, would have pointed eastward to the Mesopotamian frontier, where their great enemy, Sapor king of Persia, strove with no very great success to break through the line of Roman fortresses that protected Syria and Asia Minor. But it was not in the east that the impending storm was really brewing. It was from the north that mischief was to come. For 150 years the Romans had been well acquainted with the tribes of the Goths, the most easterly of the Teutonic nations who lay along the imperial border. All through the 3rd century, they had been molesting the provinces of the Balkan Peninsula by their incessant raids, as we have already had occasion to relate. Only after a hard struggle had they been rolled back across the Danube and compelled to limit their settlements to its northern bank in what had once been the land of the Dacians. The last struggle with them had been in the time of Constantine, who, in a war that lasted from AD 328 to AD 332, had beaten them in the open field, compelled their king to give his sons as hostages, and dictated his own terms of peace. Since then, the appetite of the Goths for war and adventure seemed permanently checked. For 40 years they had kept comparatively quiet and seldom indulged in raids across the Danube. They were rapidly settling down into steady farmers in the fertile lands on the Theiss and the Pruth. They traded freely with the Roman towns of Moesia. Many of their young warriors enlisted among the Roman auxiliary troops, and one considerable body of Gothic emigrants had been permitted to settle as subjects of the empire on the northern slope of the Balkans. By this time, many of the Goths were becoming Christians. Priests of their own blood already ministered to them, and the Bible, translated into their own language, was already in their hands. One of the earliest Gothic converts, the good Bishop Ulfilas, the first bishop of German blood that was ever consecrated, had rendered into their idiom the New Testament and most of the Old. A great portion of his work still survives, incomparably the most precious relic of the old Teutonic tongues that we now possess. The Goths were rapidly losing their ancient ferocity. Compared to the barbarians who dwelt beyond them, they might almost be called a civilized race. The Romans were beginning to look upon them as a guard set on the frontier to ward off the wilder peoples that lay to their north and east. The nation was now divided into two tribes. The Visigoths, whose tribal name was the Thervings, lay more to the south, in what are now the countries of Moldavia, Wallachia, and southern Hungary. The Ostrogoths, or tribe of the Gruthungs, lay more to the north and east, in Bessarabia, Transylvania, and the Dniester Valley. But a totally unexpected series of events were now to show how prescient Constantine had been in rearing his great fortress capital to serve as the central place of arms of the Balkan Peninsula. About the year AD 372, the Huns, an enormous Tartar horde from beyond the Don and Volga, burst into the lands north of the Euxine and began to work their way westward. The first tribe that lay in their way, the nomadic race of the Alans, they almost exterminated. Then they fell upon the Goths. The Ostrogoths made a desperate attempt to defend the line of the Dniester against the oncoming savages. Men with faces that can hardly be called faces, rather shapeless, black collops of flesh with little points instead of eyes. Little in stature but lithe and active, skillful in riding, broad-shouldered, good at the bow, stiff-necked and proud, hiding under a barely human, form the ferocity of the wild beast. But the enemy, whom the Gothic historian describes in these uninviting terms, was too strong for the Teutons of the east. The Ostrogoths were crushed and compelled to become vassals of the Huns, save a remnant who fought their way southward to the Wallachian shore, near the marshes of the delta of the Danube. Then the Huns fell on the Visigoths. The wave of invasion pressed on. The bug in the Pruth proved no barrier to the swarms of nomad bowmen, and the Visigoths, under their Duke Fritigern, fell back in dismay with their wives and children, their wagons and flocks and herds, till they found themselves with their backs to the Danube. Surrender to the enemy was more dreadful to the Visigoths than to their eastern brethren. They were more civilized, most of them were Christians, and the prospect of slavery to savages seems to have appeared intolerable to them. Pressed against the Danube and the Roman border, the Visigoths sent in despair to ask permission to cross from the emperor. A contemporary writer describes how they stood. All the multitude that had escaped from the murderous savagery of the Huns, no less than 200, 000 fighting men, besides women and old men and children, were there on the river bank, stretching out their hands with loud lamentations and earnestly supplicating leave to cross, bewailing their calamity, and promising that they would ever faithfully adhere to the imperial alliance if only the boon was granted them. At this moment, AD 376, the Roman Empire was again divided. The house of Constantine was gone, and the east was ruled by Valens, a stupid, cowardly, and avaricious prince, who had obtained the diadem and half the Roman world only because he was the brother of Valentinian, the greatest general of the day. Valentinian had taken the west for his portion, and dwelt in his camp on the Rhine and upper Danube, while Valens, slothful and timid, shut himself up with a court of slaves and flatterers in the imperial palace at Constantinople. The proposal of the Goths filled Valens with dismay. It was difficult to say which was more dangerous: to refuse a passage to 200,000 desperate men with arms in their hands and a savage foe at their backs, or to admit them within the line of river and fortress that protected the border, with an implied obligation to find land for them. After much doubting, he chose the latter alternative. If the Goths would give hostages and surrender their arms, they should be ferried across the Danube and permitted to settle as subject allies within the empire. The Goths accepted the terms, gave up the sons of their chiefs as hostages, and streamed across the river as fast as the Roman Danube flotilla could transport them. But no sooner had they reached Moesia than troubles broke out. The Roman officials at first tried to disarm the immigrants, but the Goths were unwilling to surrender their weapons, and offered large bribes to be allowed to retain them. In strict disobedience to the emperor's orders, the bribes were accepted and the Goths retained their arms. Further disputes soon broke out. The provisions of Moesia did not suffice for so many 100,000 mouths as had just entered its border, and Valens had ordered stores of corn from Asia to be collected for the use of the Goths, till they should have received and commenced to cultivate land of their own. But the governor, Lupicinus, to fill his own pockets, held back the food, and doled out what he chose to give at exorbitant prices. In sheer hunger, the Goths were driven to barter a slave for a single loaf of bread and 10 pounds of silver for a sheep. This shameless extortion continued as long as the stores and the patience of the Goths lasted. At last, the poor immigrants were actually beginning to sell their own children for slaves, rather than let them starve. This drove the Goths to desperation, and a chance affray set the whole nation in a blaze. Fritigern, with many of his nobles, 38, was dining with Count Lupicinus at the town of Marcianopolis, when some starving Goths tried to pillage the market by force. A party of Roman soldiers strove to drive them off, and were at once mishandled or slain. On hearing the tumult and learning its cause, Lupicinus recklessly bade his retinue seize and slay Fritigern and the other guests at his banquet. The Goths drew their swords and cut their way out of the palace. Then, riding to the nearest camp of his followers, Fritigern told his tale and bade them take up arms against Rome. 9. There followed a year of desperate fighting all along the Danube and the northern slope of the Balkans. The Goths, half-starved for many months, and smarting under the extortion and chicanery to which they had been subjected, soon showed that the old barbarian spirit was but thinly covered by the veneer of Christianity and civilization which they had acquired in the last half-century. The struggle resolved itself into a repetition of the great raids of the 3rd century. Towns were sacked, and the open country harried in the old style, nor was the war rendered less fierce by the fact that many runaway slaves and other outcasts among the provincial population joined the invaders. But the Roman armies still retained their old reputation. The ravages of the Goths were checked at the Balkans, and though joined by the remnants of the Ostrogoths from the Danube mouth, as well as by other tribes flying from the Huns, The Visigoths were at first held at bay by the imperial armies. A desperate pitched battle at Adsalices, near the modern Kustenge, thinned the ranks of both sides, but led to no decisive result. Next year, however, the unwarlike emperor, driven into the field by the clamors of his subjects, took the field in person, with great reinforcements brought from Asia Minor. At the same time, his nephew Gratian, a gallant young prince who had succeeded to the Empire of the West, set forth through Pannonia to bring aid to the lands of the lower Danube. The personal intervention of Valens in the struggle was followed by a fearful disaster. In 378 AD, the main body of the Goths succeeded in forcing the line of the Balkans. They were not far from Adrianople when the emperor started to attack them. With a splendid army of 60,000 men, everyone expected to hear of a victory, for the reputation of invincibility still clung to the legions, and after 600 years of war, the disciplined infantry of Rome, Rubur Peditum, whose day had lasted since the Punic Wars, were still reckoned superior when fairly handled to any amount of wild barbarians. But a new chapter of the history of the art of war was just commencing. During their sojourn in the plains of South Russia and Romania, the Goths had taken, first of all German races, to fighting on horseback. Dwelling in the Ukraine, they had felt the influence of that land, ever the nurse of cavalry from the day of the Scythian to that of the Tartar and Cossack. They had come to consider it more honorable to fight on horse than on foot, and every chief was followed by his war band of mounted men. Driven against their will into conflict with the empire, they found themselves face to face into the army that had so long held the Zoo-40 world in fear, and had turned back their own ancestors en route 3 generations before. Valens found the main body of the Goths encamped in a great lager on the plain north of Adrianople. After some abortive negotiations, he developed an attack on their front, when suddenly a great body of horsemen charged in on the Roman flank. It was the main strength of the Gothic cavalry, which had been foraging at a distance. Receiving news of the fight, it had ridden straight for the battlefield. Some Roman squadrons which covered the left flank of the emperor's army were ridden down and trampled underfoot. Then the Goths swept down on the infantry of the left wing, rolled it up, and drove it in upon the center. So tremendous was their impact that legions and cohorts were pushed together in hopeless confusion. Every attempt to stand firm failed, and in a few minutes left, center, and reserve were one undistinguishable mass. Imperial guards, light troops, lancers, auxiliaries, and infantry of the line were wedged together in a press that grew closer every moment. The Roman cavalry saw that the day was lost and rode off without another effort. Then the abandoned infantry realized the horror of their position. Equally unable to deploy or to fly, they had to stand to be cut down. Men could not raise their arms to strike a blow, so closely were they packed. Spears snapped right and left, their bearers being unable to lift them to a vertical position. Many soldiers were stifled in the press. Into this quivering mass the Goths rode, plying lance and sword against the helpless enemy. It was not till 40,000 men had fallen that the thinning of the ranks enabled the survivors to break out and follow their cavalry in a headlong flight. They left behind them, dead on the field, the emperor, the grand masters of the infantry and cavalry, the count of the palace, and 35 commanders of different corps. The Battle of Adrianople was the most fearful defeat suffered by a Roman army since Cannae, a slaughter to which it is aptly compared by the contemporary historian Ammianus Marcellinus. The army of the East was almost annihilated and was never reorganized again on the old Roman lines. This awful catastrophe brought down on Constantinople the first attack which it experienced since it had changed its name from Byzantium. After a vain assault on Adrianople, the victorious Goths pressed rapidly on towards the imperial city. Harrying the whole countryside as they passed by, they presented themselves before the Golden Gate, its southwestern exit. But the attack was destined to come to nothing. Their courage failed them when they looked on the vast circuit of walls and the enormous extent of streets. All that mass of riches within appeared inaccessible to them. They cast away the siege machines which they had prepared, and rolled backward onto Thrace. Beyond skirmishing under the walls with a body of Saracen cavalry, which had been brought up to strengthen the garrison, they made no hostile attempt on the city. So 40 years after his death, Constantine's prescience was for the first time justified. Tunisia too was right in believing that an impregnable city on the Bosphorus would prove the salvation of the Balkan Peninsula, even if all its open country were overrun by the invader. The unlucky Valens was succeeded on the throne by Theodosius, a wise and virtuous prince, who set himself to repair, by caution and courage combined, the disaster that had shaken the Roman power in the Danube lands. With the remnants of the army of the East, he made head against the barbarians. Without venturing to attack their main body, he destroyed many marauders and scattered bands, and made the continuance of the war profitless to them. If they dispersed to plunder, they were cut off. If they held together in masses, they starved. Presently Fritigern died, and Theodosius made peace with his successor Athanaric, a king who had lately come over the Danube at the head of a new swarm of Goths from the Carpathian country. Theodosius frankly promised and faithfully observed the terms that Fritigern had asked of Valens 10 years before. He granted the Goths land for their settlement in the Thracian province, which they had wasted, and enlisted in his armies all the chiefs and their war bands. Within 10 years after the fight of Adrianople, he had 40,000 Teutonic horsemen in his service. They formed the best and most formidable part of his host, and were granted a higher pay than the native Roman soldiery. The immediate military results of the policy of Theodosius were not unsatisfactory. It was his Gothic auxiliaries who won for him his two great victories over the legions of the West. When in AD 388 he conquered the rebel Magnus Maximus, and in AD 394 the rebel Eugenius. But from the political side, the experiment of Theodosius was fraught with the greatest danger that the Roman Empire had yet known. When barbarian auxiliaries had been enlisted before, they had been placed under Roman leaders and mixed with equal numbers of Roman troops. To leave them under their own chiefs and deliberately favor them at the expense of native soldiery was a most unhappy experiment. It practically put the command of the empire in their hands, for there was no hold over them save their personal loyalty to Theodosius, and the spell which the grandeur of the Roman name and Roman culture still exercised over their minds. That spell was still strong, as is shown in the story which the Gothic historian Jornandes tells about the visit of the old king Athanaric to Constantinople. When he entered the royal city, "Now," said he, "do I at last behold what I had often heard and deemed incredible." He passed his eyes hither and thither, admiring first the sight of the city, then the fleets of corn ships, then the lofty walls, then the crowds of people of all nations, mingled as the waters from divers springs mix in a single pool, then the ranks of disciplined soldiery, and at last he cried aloud, "Doubtless the emperor is as a god on earth, and he who raises a hand against him is guilty of his own blood." But this impression was not to continue for long. In AD 395, the good Emperor Theodosius, the lover of peace and of the Goths, as Threed, the fight with the Goths, 39 he was called, died, and left the throne to his two weakly sons, Arcadius and Honorius. The next chapter we'll discuss in next part. Subscribe.